Distinguished guests and panelists, good morning, good afternoon, and good day to you from across the world. I am Patricia Valdames, Senior Advisor to the Secretary General of the Community of Democracies, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this discussion towards a Summit for Democracy. The event today is jointly organized by the Permanent Secretariat of the Community of Democracies, International IDEA, and the Open Government Partnership. In our time today, we will hear highlights on the current global state of democracy, identifying challenges and opportunities for the advancement of democracy worldwide, as well as discuss what actions may be put in place to uphold basic democratic practices and institutions at all levels that can serve as a roadmap for a conversation at a global gathering for democracy. We are delighted today to have with us high-level representatives of the three convening organizations that have been carrying out global democracy strengthening work for many years. They will be sharing lessons learned to support democracy worldwide and provide potential ideas that can inform a global summit for democracy. The event will also feature distinguished representatives from civil society from different parts of the world, who will also share their priorities and possible outcomes, as well as key activities for a global gathering for democracy. But before we start, I would like to ask and to invite you as participants to write questions you may have in the chat box, and we will come back to you during the Q&A session later in the event. Also, to allow for more time for this fruitful discussion that we will be having today, I would actually like to invite you to read the speakers' full biographies by following the link that we will be sharing right now in the chat box as well. So without any more due time, allow me to introduce and invite our first speaker, Ted Picone, Chief Engagement Officer and a very close friend of the Community of Democracies, for a keynote on the first steps for a Summit for Democracy. Ted, I am turning to you. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Patricia, for organizing us, and to the hosts of this event. It's very nice to see you all, Kevin and Tom and Joe, and all of our other panelists today. What I'm going to try to do is to give some framing remarks about where we are at this moment in the kind of global democracy front, and come up with some guiding principles and goals, and then some specific ideas for what collective action among these democracies would mean in the form of a summit for democracy. So let me start by outlining just very briefly, what is the case for a summit for democracy? Why do we need it right now? And I think we know from a lot of evidence that's accumulating that there's no question we need a reboot of both national and collective efforts to strengthen and protect democracy from a host of both old and new challenges. And among them, I would cite a few: rising authoritarianism and even aggression led by China and Russia, including direct interference in electoral processes in different countries. Second, the rise of populist nationalism and the undercurrents of racism that are driving that narrative. A longstanding erosion of rule of law and human rights practices that we've seen and documented by many organizations around the world. And of growing concern, the negative role of digital technology in polluting our information space, which is the essence of liberal, pluralist democracy. So on top of those threats, we have a complicating factor, a very serious one, which is the impact of COVID-19 on the rule of law and democracy. The global pandemic has really underscored how much work democratic governments need to do to improve the delivery of public goods. We're seeing in particular threats around accountable governance, the states of emergency that have been imposed, the lockdowns, and the way those have been used as pretexts to crack down on opponents of a regime. Access to justice for all, the ability of people to actually have access to fundamental justice services. Open government and anti-corruption efforts are being undermine the flow, the billions of dollars that are going through the system in emergency relief and economic support is ripe for all kinds of corruption. And then fundamental rights and non-discrimination. I mean, we've seen how the impact of the pandemic has made weak, more vulnerable sectors of society even in a more difficult situation. So the COVID-19 moment and crisis is really an opportunity not only to repair, but truly to build forward by addressing the root causes of problems that existed long before the pandemic. And I see it as an opportunity to set new precedents and adopt new attitudes and learn from our mistakes. I think the Biden administration is off to a good start in articulating the core themes and principles behind the summit idea. It was something that Joe Biden as a candidate put forward and is very committed to seeing through in his first year or so of his presidency. And I think what we're hearing from senior officials is moving forward with humility about the United States' own shortcomings, and also to underscore the direct competition between the model of accountable governance practiced by leading democracies and the state-dominated and illiberal model offered by China and other like-minded states. Now, this kind of competition the US cannot do alone. It needs to build common purpose and effective collaboration among democratic societies, not just governments, to prevail in this competition. They've been articulating that quite well, I think, and in the meeting with Prime Minister of Japan and in the outreach to Europe, you're seeing that effort underway. So the summit can help set the agenda for democratic renewal and mobilize the political will that's needed in this contest. So the question for me is now how best to go about it. Obviously, this can't just be a one-off, not a show. It needs to be part of a larger strategy to support democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. So what would that look like? So some core goals and principles for success. I feel very strongly, based on a lot of years in this field, that the focus has to be on the national and local levels. That collective action, if we get too caught up in what has to happen at the global level, we sometimes pull our attention away from what has to happen at the local level. And collective action will only work if it comes from strong democracies, stable societies that respect the rule of law and deliver good governance for their people. So thinking about how to move forward on some guiding principles, the United States and the other partners in this effort need to be open to learning from each other. And there's a lot of innovation out there. The Club of Madrid is organizing a project right now that is looking at how innovative practices can be shared more broadly. Second, the United States and other democracies need to lead by example. They need to show that democracies can govern by the rule of law and that this best protects human dignity, provides peace and security, and a fair social contract. And then, of course, there needs to be some serious repair work of the damage of the last several years, the attacks and the backsliding, and deal with the underlying problems of corruption and impunity and discrimination and inequality. So what do individual states need to do to strengthen their own democracies at home? And of course, it highly depends on the specific circumstances of each situation, type of political system, their traditions, constitutional law, what stage of development. So I don't think the purpose of the summit or the community democracies, other bodies, should be overly prescriptive from the top. It's got to be a bottom-up approach. But there are some common threats that seem to be prevalent across most democracies. And I want to highlight 5 examples and some potential solutions. First is the problem, and Kevin knows this very well, of money in politics and the role of special interests, the lack of transparency on how money is flowing into campaigns, the way elites capture different agencies of government and public procurement. So we know some tools that can help deal with that. Societies, democratic societies need to adopt and enforce right to information. That new laws to regulate political finance are needed. There needs to be better financial and tax disclosure for high-ranking political officials and legislators. And there's a pretty long list of other steps that can be taken in that field. A second priority would be to deal with the shrinking civic space. We're seeing ongoing threats and a decline in right to association and freedom of speech. And I think here there are many things that can be done. I'll say a little bit more about that later on in the context of the summit. But I think lawyers and law students have a role to play in defending rights activists that are being unfairly targeted for the most basic elements of democratic action. A third problem is, of course, disinformation. And I won't go into detail. We all know how serious that problem is. But one thing that democracies can do better is to protect independent media and investigative journalists, whistleblowers, those that are actually providing the kind of information that those in power may not want to hear, but it's important that citizens can look to some sector of society that's looking out for the public interest. A fourth priority and problem, the securitization of politics. And speaking specifically of militaries and police, that on the military front, to this day, we still see outright military coups, but other forms of heavy-handed alliances between military and civilian politicians that are, making democracy difficult to grow. And also, of course, the importance of holding police accountable for human rights abuses. And then finally, a fifth priority is the issue of inequality. And inequality is getting worse. And the need for democracies to adopt more inclusive economies and politics, expand women's access to power and economic roles in society, and punish discrimination of any kind, whether it's sexism or racism, xenophobia, homophobia, etc. So that is kind of my short menu of things that have to happen at the local level and will make democracies stronger. Now, turning to the question of collective action, where does collective action by democracies matter? Number one, I think, is let's raise our ambitions here. I think there is importance to having a sense of we're all imperfect and we all can do better. And so the sense of striving forward is important. And to hold each other accountable to the commitments that have been made. And the Open Government Partnership National Action Plans would be one example of a way in which that can happen. Also, we need a sense of solidarity among democracies in the face of these onslaughts by autocrats. Democracy is hard. Let's lend a hand to each other. And it's not just about governments. Let's build a broader movement to support democracy with leaders from various fields, from the arts, from sports, from business, to support that cause. Collective action also matters when it comes to supporting small d Democrats. Human rights defenders on the front line are risking their lives every day for rights that we sometimes take for granted, and they need to be supported. How does that happen? Well, let's talk about sanctioning abusers and the idea of expanding the Magnitsky Act and turning it into a global Magnitsky Act. And of course, that has to happen at the national and regional level, some building blocks. But I think some kind of collective show of condemnation that has some teeth would be a way to deal with this problem. Of course, funding independent media is critical, and providing refuge to dissidents. Democracy should be stepping forward when folks cannot live in the societies in which they find themselves because of their political action. Let's provide them refuge. more broadly, and this goes to the point about the global Magnitsky, I think collective action could also revolve around developing out more tools to carry out both carrots and sticks when things go awry. But let's do it in a coherent and coordinated fashion. It will have much greater impact. And that means crafting some coalitions of the willing that are, customized to each situation. And we know from practice that this can be effective. At the UN Human Rights Council, we see efforts to build cross-regional coalitions to move the ball forward on specific cases and themes. I think you also need to shore up the collective response to cases where it's a flagrant violation of the democratic constitutional order. And those are taking different forms. We see the military coup in Burma, obvious case, rule of law backsliding in Poland and Hungary that the European Union is addressing in various ways. Or we see kind of the erosion of checks and balances that finally get to a point of no return. And those need to be addressed collectively. Or politicians that incite mob violence against political institutions. I think you all know who I'm referring to there. That's got to require some type of, at a minimum, condemnation of that behavior. And of course, there's systemic electoral fraud and the refusal to accept the result of free and fair elections. That will continue to be a critical area of collective action. And then, of course, there will be much more work to institutionalize a meaningful role for a diverse civil society at the multilateral level. I mean, if you take, for example, the UN special session on corruption that's coming up in June, it's been very difficult for civil society to get a seat at the table. And this is 2021. I mean, it's hard to believe that, especially on an issue like corruption, that this would be so difficult. So let's institutionalize that across the board. So finally, what should a summit for democracy look like? Well, you need leaders that are actually fully committed to the idea of making democracy, rights, and rule of law a pillar of their national security and national identity and national pride, and not just a throwaway line in the speech or a sop to Washington. Now, who should be invited to this meeting? I argue that you should keep it small, keep it focused, and go with those who are most committed. So on the invitation of governments, I would say go deep rather than broad. And I've learned from practice why that matters, and I'd be happy to go into it further. And then before people come to the summit, before states get there, require concrete commitments from states and other participants, frankly, before admission. So the pay-to-play idea. Furthermore, I would require participating governments to consult with their own domestic civil society, both before, during, and after the summit. And in this front, I would go broad rather than deep, and make sure you include underrepresented voices that traditionally have not really been in these kinds of multilateral gatherings. It's a great opportunity to build a broader movement. And as host, the United States should lead and consult with more diverse civil society on who should be invited and what should be on the agenda. And it should include labor and business and religious groups and parliamentarians, legislatures, as key voices for inputs and outputs. And then finally, a summit, I think, should make a special effort to call attention to the small d Democrats I referred to earlier in the hardest places, in Belarus, in Myanmar, in Hong Kong, in Eritrea, in Venezuela. Let's make sure that their voices are heard and that they get the support that they need going forward. So thank you all for listening to that long menu and list of ideas, and I really look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Ted, for your presentation. This was quite good, and for setting the context really for today's conversation and highlighting those very important priorities that we should certainly keep in mind when we discuss how to make democracy stronger and as we discuss several ideas that can inform what a summit for democracy can look like. So thank you once again, Ted. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our second speaker today. I would like to give the floor to Maria Serungitsesai. She is a founder and activist of the Change Tanzania movement. Maria, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And I'm very excited to have this event and to be part of such a great conversation with such great people. And I think that the best way I can say is that TED has provided us with a very good basic to start with. I don't know if people saw that I was just nodding all the time and agreeing with a lot of things that TED has been saying. And I think that Tanzania can be looked at as a case study. The reason that I say that is that Tanzania 6 years ago looked to be on track to become one of the rare countries in Africa or in the region that was really forward thinking in terms of democracy. It was among the first African countries to join the Open Government Partnership. So that was, all the great signs were there with, quite a vibrant media and opposition. But what happened in the past 6 years with the Magufuli administration was that all these early reforms that looked to be reforms that used to be as a good way forward suddenly were rolled back. And that is because the problem is systemic. And I really appreciate what Ted talked about, that what we really have is we oftentimes have a nice veneer that looks very nice. We have got very great sentences that people put forward, especially politicians, but there's very little systemic change. What has happened is something that I think really showcases what is and how quickly democracy can be pushed back. And it's a very methodic way that, for example, democracy was pushed back within 6 years. We regressed 20 years in terms of some of the freedoms that we had gained. And that was through what I call, well, it's not my own, actually, it was coined by the Human Rights Watch, lawfare. So this was what the Tanzanian government used, whereby it passed laws, and these laws legalized authoritarianism. It cemented some of the most segregating laws that discriminated people, targeting a lot of groups, especially, for example, the Companies Act and the Non-Governmental Organizational Act, which then led, for example, to a lot of the civil society being curtailed. The Change Tanzania movement, which was actually an organization, eventually was deregistered and went to court, but the case is still ongoing. So what we're seeing is that suddenly the authoritarianism, the oversight that would be done independently by civil society, that was done by media, that was done by the political parties, became outlawed. So even if you go to court today, you would not be able to win because it's actually on the side of the authoritarian regime to deregister you or to delegitimize you. The other thing that really happened has been the way that the opposition, especially when it comes to the activities, the political activities, they were intimidated, attacked, harassed, and the entire rule of law that Ted has been talking about was undermined. So I think that the first thing that needs to be done is to always roll back or to push back against this crouching authoritarianism. It is very, very important because what has happened is the world was watching. All these laws were coming one after another. I think overall, we sat down with some of our colleagues. We have about 30 to 40 laws that were passed in about 2 to 3 years. And they were passed with a certificate of urgency. And when people could see it, but nobody did anything. The international community didn't do anything. Internally, a few of us saw where this was going, but everybody was just busy fighting fire. So I think there has to be a very aggressive, and I agree with the concept of a coalition of the willing, to sort of coalesce quickly and very rapidly start pushing back. There has to be a form of sanction. When some of these actions start to happen, there has to be a very definite and a very, very targeted action against these regimes. I've seen similar things happening also in other countries in the region, and that is why I'm very concerned, because I'm seeing the entire region rolling back some of the freedoms that were earned. There was a very interesting other point that I wanted to add, which was about the digital. I call it the digital frontier. And I think unlike some of the Western world, including the United States, for us, the digital frontier is actually a great frontier. It remained the only independent forum or the only independent platform where some of us were still able to speak up. This included some people who were whistleblowers, who could hide their identity. Some of us were outspoken, but we got delegitimized. We still had the space on the digital front. I think that there has to be a much wider conversation and not look necessarily at digital technology as a bad thing. I think there's some really good things about the digital technology, and there's some really, of course, dangerous side to it. I think also the fact, and talking about COVID, of having in Tanzania this digital front, the COVID-19, I'm sure some of you have heard, pandemic has been basically denied by Magufuli himself and his regime, following his death. And right now, the current president, Samia Suluhu, is saying that there will be more looking into the COVID situation, but still little action has been taken against COVID-19. This has led to sometimes to the impression that nothing is happening, but in reality, it's not true. People are dying. Doctors are complaining about sometimes of waves coming and going. We are seeing some of the more complicated, complex problems coming up from COVID, but there is no data. We were able, through our movement, Change Tanzania, to do an informal online survey, and we released a report which sort of gives a snapshot of what is happening. And this, without the digital frontier, wouldn't be possible. To finish up, I completely agree with what was said about, Ted, I think, used the word, the small d Democrats, whether you would call them that or the human rights defenders. I call them active citizens. I think some of us became activists not because we wanted to. We have a day job, we have businesses that we run. I'm in the media. Of course, my media has been suspended twice by the government, but nonetheless, we do have our own way of doing business. The biggest problem that happens is that these active citizens who sometimes come forward and try to push back against authoritarianism are not looked upon as an institution. The minute you're delegitimized, it means you don't have a platform to engage or to do anything. So that's why we're left with the digital frontier. These are people that definitely, I believe, movements can be built, resources can be tapped. And I think that the Summit for Democracy has to definitely keep this in mind. We cannot always operate, especially in repressive environment, through very stiff infrastructure or institutional structures. So I think that is very important. Accountability, to finish up, is the most important. What we saw atrocities during the 2020 elections. Scores of people were killed. Many more have been imprisoned. Some few hundreds are still sitting in prison, or they're out on bail, but they've been accused of some of the most ludicrous crimes. And what has happened is nobody has been held accountable. The country right now is on the path feeling that there is a chance for reform. But if people who have been behind these atrocities, and it is not one person, was not John Magufuli himself, but there was a whole host of enablers and implementers, if they're not held accountable, this is going to fester. And there has to be a mechanism, and I completely agree with Ted, whereby some of these enablers are targeted, whether it's going to be through the Global Magnitsky Act or through individual countries act, but it's very important. Because just to finish up, I think the Summit for Democracy has to reflect the spirit of democracy, which is government of the people, by the people, for the people. It has to be bottom up. It cannot be a meeting of heads of states trying to push down an agenda, because as we saw in Tanzania, then you have got democracy as a favor and not as a right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria, for those very important insights that you provided, and bringing really that case study of Tanzania. I think you mentioned, and I think it's important for all of us to remind ourselves that we need to keep that constant watch, monitor, and look closely to those early signs of decline of democracy, and be ready certainly to take action and be more proactive and push back against authoritarianism. So thank you once again for your remarks. Now, I would like to introduce our next distinguished speaker and a very good friend also of the community, Kevin Casas-Zamora, Secretary General for International IDEA. Secretary General, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Patricia, and thank you also very much to Secretary General Tom Garrett and the Community of Democracies, as well as to Joe Powell and the Open Government Partnership for organizing this event with us here today. And I'm also very, very glad to see my fellow panel members representing the Change Tanzania movement and the Natural Resource Governance Institute. And also my dear friend and old colleague, Ted Picone. It's wonderful to see you here and as sharp as ever, as we can attest. I only have a few minutes, so I would like to focus this brief intervention on what I hope that this summit and the journey towards it will mean for democracy around the world. And first, I want to emphasize that what I would like to see is a summit for democracy and not a summit of democracies. And this is a very important distinction, both because we can't afford to get lost in discussions about the participants list, but also because I think that this summit, and this has been mentioned already, needs to include more than just governments. Otherwise, we risk turning the discussions into geopolitical wrestling matches with little impact and little bearing for democracy on the ground. And this is why I would like to see an inclusive summit where other stakeholders such as civil society, academia, the media, but also, and this has been mentioned already as well, also those defending democracy in the trenches in countries that are not democracies can be represented and heard. So once again, if we are serious about turning this event into a pivotal point for democracy, it can just be a summit of democracies. This said, this summit and the road towards it won't have a lasting impact without an agreement and a clear action agenda based on the simple question: what do we need globally to better protect democracy? If you ask me, 4 things are needed. First of all, we need a sense of urgency about the global predicament of democracy and a sense of humility about the task at hand. The trends about democracy are unmistakable, and I won't repeat them here. The severe headwinds for democracy were there before the pandemic, and the pandemic has turbocharged those wins. But those problematic trends are also global in nature. They're not to be found only or even primarily in young and underdeveloped democracies. We just need to see what has happened in the US and even in Europe, where some of the most severe cases of democratic backsliding are found today. The implication here is that we have to meet this challenge together and with a sense of humility. To borrow a phrase from a great recent article by Tom Carothers and Francis Brown, there is no sun at the center of democracy's solar system anymore. We're just a bunch of planets, some bigger than others, trying to avoid falling into a black hole. The debate about how to protect democracy needs to be more plural, devoid of hegemonic models or pretensions. The task at hand is about creating a global network to protect democracy. And this network is not just about governments, partnerships, joint efforts, that's what we need the most. The second thing we need to protect democracy is a common and better understanding of the threats. We need to generate new and better analytical instruments. What has happened with democratic setbacks is somewhat similar to what has happened with war. You know, war used to be a very clear-cut affair. Either you were at war or you were not. Well, not anymore. A democratic breakdown used to be very simple to spot. Not anymore. Now the erosion of democracy comes in all sorts of shades of gray that render the threat much more difficult to identify and to counter. One of the practical implications of this is that the clauses that many intergovernmental organizations have in their charters to protect democracy are conceived in terms of threats that are far less important now than they were in the past. They were conceived in terms of threats, in terms of attacks that were perpetrated onto democratically elected governments and not by them, which is the real issue right now. And then we have new and pressing threats that we've hardly begun to understand, such as the extreme polarization nurtured by social media and the proliferation of disinformation campaigns, which have a less defined, amorphous, ghost-like quality to them. If we are to defend democracy, we need to understand much better what we are up against. The third thing that we need to do is put the governance agenda at the heart of public debates and equip democracies to solve problems for people, particularly when faced with big crises. You know, we can make a case for democracy in terms of values until we're blue. But when it comes to political systems for a high proportion of people, the proof of the pie is in the eating. And we must take this governance agenda seriously, lest people give up on the ability of democracy to solve problems and run for the authoritarian option, which is often a mirage. And this is something, by the way, that multilateral organizations can do very well. I mean, we can activate multilateral mechanisms to increase the learning and the exchange of good practices to improve the ability of democracies to respond to the demands of citizens. Here, good practices to strengthen citizen trust in institutions is particularly important. We have a duty to help countries up their game to deal with the pandemic of corruption that is eating away the legitimacy of democracies. If we don't do that, trust will never be built. And let me just flag that this agenda connected to governance is especially vital in the context of the climate crisis, for which the pandemic is merely a warm-up. And last but not least, the fourth thing that we need is more funding for the work of protecting democracy, quite frankly. I mean, I hope that democratic governments and democratic powers put the money where their mouth is. There are many work streams that need funding. We need to fund better analysis to measure the performance of democracies, not for its own sake, but to generate early warning systems to detect these new sophisticated threats that we face. We need to fund the protection of some of the building blocks of healthy democratic systems, such as the work of civil society and independent media outlets currently under assault. We need to fund the protection of election integrity and the perception of election integrity. The combination of extreme polarization and disinformation is really having a toxic effect on the perception of the integrity of elections. I mean, we have just seen how some of the most outlandish fraud claims made after the last US election were copied almost verbatim by the generals in Myanmar. I'm afraid this may become par for the course all over the world with terrible effects for democracy. And as I said, we need to fund the dissemination of good practices to help democracies deliver for citizens. So this is not free. As the old bumper sticker about education has it, if you think defending democracy is expensive, try the alternative. So what do we need to better protect democracy globally? Sense of urgency and humility, a better understanding of the threats, a robust democratic governance agenda, and lots of funding for this work. And I do hope that the summit will reflect and help coalesce global will to undertake all, or at least some, of these very urgent endeavors. Thank you.
Patricia, you're muted.
You're muted, Patricia. Just when you were saying nice things about my remarks.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. Sorry, some issues with technicalities here. My apologies. Yes, as I was saying, very nice things about you, Kevin. But I think I was mentioning the importance that you brought to the discussion about multilateralism and what the organizations can also bring to that to better protect democracy worldwide. And also the better understanding that we still need to have about those threats to democracy, having the robust democratic agenda that you mentioned. And I think a key element to everything that we're speaking today is the funding that needs to go certainly hand in hand to protect democracy. So once again, thank you for those words. Now I would like to turn to Sunita Kaimal. She is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Natural Resource Governance Institute. We will hear from her some very important civil society perspective on this issue. Sunita, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Patricia. We are, of course, all here today because we recognize the potential power of a global gathering on democracy. But as others have said, I think we all have questions about the what, the agendas that are really needed to advance, to bolster democracy in this particular moment. But also the how. What is the process for actually putting those ideas into action? On the what, we really cannot silo the summits. We will have the greatest impact if we can identify and focus our collective energies on issues that bridge multiple summits. The magnitude of the challenges we face, of course, demands that we don't talk about summits just as ends in themselves. Instead, I believe that summits and other forums should serve as a series of action-forcing moments on the pressing challenges that Ted and Kevin and others have laid out. I'd like to pick up on one specific issue that Kevin flagged, the climate emergency. We can and should work to bridge convenings and ambitions on climate and democracy. Governments and civil society actors are engaging in these, but really as parallel and different conversations. Yet we know that the threats of an accelerating climate emergency and the threats to democracy interrelate. Consider our ambitions to combat corruption and to counter kleptocracy. The lifeblood of many authoritarian regimes is oil money. They produce 50% of the world's oil. These regimes persist by growing the oil sector and then milking it for funds. Oil sector corruption also threatens fragile democracies. Just take the car wash scandal in Brazil. The scandal disenfranchised voters, took down the ruling party, and reverberated politically across the entire region. A corrupt ruling elite fueled by oil has no incentive to help wean producers or consumers off of fossil fuels. Corruption and kleptocracy are therefore a death knell of the global climate goals. They sustain oil dependency. And unless we address anti-democratic regimes that thrive on oil, a greener globe will really be out of reach. I believe we have a unique and narrow window to capitalize on the ambitions of this week's Leaders Summit on Climate, bringing climate from there into the Summit for Democracy and democracy into COP26. Doing so will ensure that both are more relevant, more timely, and actually more likely to lead to change. The more bridges that we can build between summits on a concerted set of commitments, the more likely we are to be able to succeed in moving from rhetoric to action. Secondly, I'd like to talk about the how, and really to underscore some of the points already raised about the need to institutionalize civil society engagement to build and sustain momentum. The development and the execution of the summit should really be a model for citizen engagement. We should embody and enact the fundamental values of democracy: transparency, accountability, participation, inclusion. This will start, of course, with the way that US officials are designing the process, but all governments concerned about democracy can and should then replicate that approach. To institutionalize civil society engagement requires that government officials regard civil society actors not as obstacles, but actually as activators, as resources, as technical support that helps to power the change that we are seeking. It also requires that governments move from consultation on that which frankly has already been decided to co-creation, to designing the agenda and commitments in an inclusive manner in collaboration with citizens whose lives we are all seeking to impact. It also requires that governments engage beyond the elite usual suspects, and that we as civil society ensure that we're not replicating the echo chambers that sparked waves of populism. Now, what does this de-siloing summits and sustained civil society engagement really look like in practice? I know it sounds quite daunting and we know it's not easy, but we can learn from the example of the 2016 UK Anti-Corruption Summit. In advance of the summit, civil society organizations at the local and international levels helped to identify open contracting and beneficial ownership as two key global priorities to combat corruption. They contributed technical expertise to design then relevant national commitments. Throughout the summit, civil society kept the pressure on and ensured high-profile uptake of these issues. The Open Government Partnership was identified in the summit communique as a key mechanism to monitor implementation and thereby formalize the ongoing role of civil society in national processes. After the summit, civil society organizations and governments leveraged other political moments and vehicles: the G7, the G20, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, building bridges again to reinforce these messages and provide further pathways for implementation. As a result, we have seen major wins on beneficial ownership and on open contracting in countries as far-ranging as the US, the UK, Ghana, Mongolia, and as recently as this week with Canada's announcement of plans for a public beneficial ownership register. And on this, I'd like to push back a little bit on Ted's point about an elite invite list and endorse Kevin's more inclusive approach. I'd note that these governments that made commitments and we saw big wins were not necessarily the governments that we initially thought would really lead. This speaks to the value of perhaps having a more open tent on the invitees. The possibilities really are in reach. Many of us, of course, approach summits with a bit of trepidation, concerned that they'll take up tremendous energy, but again, amount to little more than empty rhetoric and missed opportunities. In some ways, it's in the very name. A summit should not be the apex, achievable only by a select few individuals with a handful of exhausted Sherpas carrying the load. Think of the Davos Summit. It's literally atop mountains and now a byword for exclusivity and elites. But if we champion transnational, multi-sectoral issues that leverage, galvanize, and bridge summits, we will elevate the entire global conversation. If we can imprint civil society engagement into the DNA of political gatherings, again, before, during, and after, we'll maintain momentum rather than collapse at the finish line. And if we open the conversation, not limited to a privileged few, we will spur innovation and lift up reformers across countries. If we address the what and the how well, I believe that we can transform these political opportunities into real-world possibilities and summits into highlands. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sunita. Once again, I think I've been hearing from the very beginning, I think it's very important to highlight the nature of inclusiveness of a Summit for Democracy. And something important that you noted right now, it's the link between summits. For example, you highlighted the link between the climate emergency and democracy. That's very important to bring into this discussion in both summits, actually. And something else, which is the importance and the key role of civil society. of civil society engagement, not only in this consultation for the summit, but during the summit and after the summit. So all very important issues that we certainly have taken note, and I'm sure we will be discussing further. Thank you, Sunita. Our next speaker is Maria Barón. She is a Global Executive Director for Directorio Legislativo in Argentina, and she's also the Civil Society Co-Chair for the Open Government Partnership. Maria, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Patricia, and I'm very happy to be in this panel and to exchange with everyone today. Hopefully get some ideas, more clear ideas into the road to Summit for Democracy next year. So with many agreements with many of the things and highlights that people have said before me, I think the first issue that I wanted to highlight is the issue about the one of the biggest democracies today, the US, is very, very divided. And having said that, we know that there's a big percentage of the people in the US that think today that the elections of last year are not fair or were not fair. This means that many of the democracies in the world, besides the US, have a problem as well. And we see it every day. We see that we are living in an increasingly very polarized world where if we see the measurements of the approval ratings of the heads of state, we see the negatives and the positive measurements very at the very ends, so very high in each of the ends. Some of the groups that have developed ratings have developed what they call hate ratings, where they measure the dislike and what they don't like about the opposition parties or the different positions that there are in specific countries. So this to say that we are living in a world, I think, or we think in our internal debates, that we label ourselves all the time. It's a world where it's divided between us and them. So we're either right or left, or we're populist or non-populist, or we're pro or con regarding specific issues. And these idea of dividing ourselves also goes into not only the issue, but judging the person that holds that specific position. And so that on one hand, and on the other hand, a lot of demands from the communities, from the different countries that need to be addressed and delivered. And so this is a world in a democracy that needs to be rethought or renewed. In something that we always say in an internal debate as well is looking into the debate next year in April or whenever. So what does democracy bring to the party? What democracy brings to these people? And so we don't have, of course, none of us has the crystal ball, but I think one of the ways forward is something that was just said, and not because I'm a fan of OGP, but because I think it's an interesting way of going forward is the work that has been done towards dialogue and towards partnership and towards stitching and sharing concepts and trying to bridge the different ideas from one side to the other. Instead of hating each other, let's bridge. So there are a lot of groups and a lot of thinkers putting time around this. And I think the efforts that OGP can bring with its experience, I think it's really, really valuable. And to sort of sort the discussion around the puzzle of democracy. I think you know that the government of South Korea and myself had the steering committee of OGP during 2021, and we have expressed our 3 pillars of priorities that revolve around the first, around civic space. Many of you have already expressed their concern about civic space. So we are trying to highlight the will and the efforts of the different governments to address these issues. The second one, and I think Ted mentioned it, is about corruption, and within corruption, the issue about money in politics is really, really relevant. And third, the digital governance around the different standards and rules that there are in the world around this. And in order to put this into action and to deepen sort of the priorities that we have this year, and this year specifically with so many problems that we're having and so many backlashes, we're asking with the government of Korea as of last month to sort of what we call the call to action. And this call to action is asking the government specifically to raise their bar a little bit, raise their ambition during this year of so many debts and demands that we have from our different communities, and raise their hands and do more in a way to address these 3 pillars. What we're asking specifically is come to during 21 to 21, if you are co-creating this in your action plans in your different countries, or if you're not, raise your ambition as well and come up with a commitment without a specific plan, but come to the end of the year where we're meeting and trying to gather as many heads of state as possible in the Summit of Korea, which will be in December, with the implementation of creative ideas to showcase and share the world with what you have done. And so so in a way, the efforts that the ideas of what ideas were implemented. So at the heart of this, of course, is I think the most beautiful thing about OGP, which is the idea of co-creation. So to bring the different views from different parts of a specific country at the local, really local level, or at the thematic community that really works on specific things, to try to address those demands that are there, like everyone said, before the pandemic, but are really in an emergency state today. So I think if looking into the possible summit next year, if this idea of bridging, of co-creating can be brought, I think OGP can be of a really interesting way. Of course, it's not a perfect initiative that was started in 2011, but maybe things that weren't working and that work now, I think could be brought there and add to the discussion about how to deliver democracy better to the people that are in the different countries, especially the people that need it most now. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you for your views and noting once again the importance of dialogue, the importance of partnerships, and issues that certainly need to be addressed, such as civic space, digital governance, corruption that has mentioned even before by most of our speakers, and also the idea of taking into account or considering, looking at possible bridges and a co-creation, which is something that, of course, OGP does so very well between governments and civil society. Now it is my pleasure to introduce and give the floor to Joe Powell. Joe is the Deputy Chief Executive Officer for the Open Government Partnership. Joe, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Patricia, and thanks to everyone. It's perils of coming later in the agenda that there's been so many good points made. I certainly don't want to bore everyone by repeating them. But let me just start by stating the obvious about why there is such interest and goodwill, I think, around this idea. And that is because US leadership also matters. And I would just want to recognize that despite the troubling situation with backsliding in the US democracy in the past few years, if we are going to try and reverse the trend that many of the speakers have spoken about, US leadership really does matter, as it did with the founding of the Community of Democracies and indeed the founding of OGP. So we've heard a lot about why this summit is important and what issues it should cover. And I think that what I can probably most helpfully contribute is to focus on some of the design aspects of this summit. And if you imagine in your head what comes to mind when you hear the phrase head of state summit, there are probably flags and handshakes and speeches, and Kevin, you have great flags. It's no offense to your flags. And you have a dry, high-level communique watered down to the lowest common denominator, maybe some civil society side events, and maybe the odd diplomatic disagreement. But generally, everyone goes home comfortable and happy, and then generally very little changes. We cannot afford a summit for democracy that repeats this outdated approach. So instead, I'd like to suggest how to design a summit for democracy in a very different way so that it actually has a chance of helping turn the tide on democratic backsliding. And to do that, I just want to suggest 4 simple design principles that can put this summit on a path for success. Firstly, the price of admission needs to be clear. Whether it's a small or a wide group of countries, there needs to be an entry ticket. And to my mind, those are the type of trackable and concrete commitments that Ted introduced at the beginning. So for example, where we have small groups of countries who have been leading on issues like open contracting and procurement reform, or like beneficial ownership, as Sunita mentioned, this international summit could help be a tipping point for those. So taking some of these innovations and expanding them to more countries. Another example could be on gender equality and inclusion, where we know some governments have made great progress on tackling issues like gender pay gaps or increasing inclusion in decision-making, but those are by no means global norms. How can we take those innovations and scale them up? A 4th area might be civic space, where, as we know, there have been a proliferation of attacks on basic freedoms and crackdowns on civil society, worsened even further by the pandemic. And for each of those topics, the US also has to lead by example. So with humility, for example, implementing the new beneficial ownership rules that were passed just a couple of months ago, or restoring and repairing the Civil Rights Unit at the Department of Justice. But what those commitments look like also matters. They need to be smart. They need to be trackable. There ideally should be a pre-summit review and a feedback mechanism to countries before they come to the summit. And afterwards, they should be embedded with concrete milestones for implementation so that collectively our organizations here can help to follow up and provide support for that implementation. I would even suggest that there is a commitment registry, an open data registry of summit commitments to help with tracking and uptake that can be made interoperable with commitments made at all of the other summits that Maria and Sunita mentioned. So firstly, it's price of entry and types of commitments. Secondly, as has been well covered already, the role of civil society before, during, and after. I think it's critically important that there are pre-summit national meetings between invited governments and domestic civil society to discuss and even co-create what the head of state comes to announce. And many of us on this panel can offer support around that. And then similarly at the summit itself, civil society should not just be in the side events, they should be in the bilaterals, on the main stage, and together providing recommendations to leaders, and particularly hearing from younger leaders and emerging leaders who are working on democracy in the countries that attend. And there should also be support for civil society afterwards to play a watchdog role so that these commitments are actually implemented, and even to work with governments on implementing them. So that's the second point on civil society. The third point, I think, as Kevin mentioned, we need to think about the follow-up now. This area of work is dramatically under-resourced. So if we're thinking about implementation support now, that means USAID, for example, thinking about how it can align its programs at the country and thematic and global level with the topics being addressed by the summit, whether those are anti-corruption reforms, civic space reforms, or countering authoritarianism. Similarly, when the summit takes place, it shouldn't just be the US agencies that lead on foreign policy at the table. We should have the Access to Justice team, for example, which used to do such great work in the Department of Justice and should be, I think, reformed. Other agencies that I know US civil society groups are keen to see involved include the Treasury and FinCEN that monitors money laundering, and other financial supervisory bodies. All of them have key portfolios around democracy and anti-corruption, and they should be at the table too. So that's the third point on thinking about the follow-up now. And then finally, as has also been mentioned by others, this summit should not be seen in isolation. We have a G7 coming up in June, where there is a focus on open societies and some specific anti-corruption reforms that the UK is seeking to push forward. A G20 hosted by Italy, which will have a new anti-corruption plan. The UN Special Session on Corruption, the COP, Community of Democracies, and so on, the OGP Global Summit. These all need to link together as part of a roadmap of related summits that reinforce each other rather than fall into the types of silos that often happens. And certainly at OGP, we want to help be that connective tissue across these different events and therefore supporting on the implementation. So that's the fourth point on connecting across. So in conclusion, if we want to design this summit in a way that actually leads to success, that gives it a chance of being a successful summit, the choices we make now are really crucial. One path will lead to a traditional multilateral summit with low ambition, very little chance of meeting the moment in terms of the crisis of democracy that we've been in. Another path leads to something that can be a real launch pad for actions that begin to herald in a better era for more open democracies fit for the challenges of our time. And that's the path I think we must take. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. Certainly for those thought-provoking ideas and kind of bringing together some of the discussions that our earlier speakers have mentioned, including the importance of concrete commitments in going into the summit. The idea of an open registry of summit commitments, I think that's a wonderful idea. And once again, highlighting the very important role of civil society before, during, and after the summit, thinking about the follow-up of the summit, and also important, the connections or the building bridges, looking at this summit not as a standalone event, but rather linking it together with other global summits that have been mentioned before. Once again, thank you, Joe. And lastly, but certainly not least, let me introduce our final speaker, Thomas Garrett, Secretary General of the Community of Democracies. Secretary General, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Patricia. And I just want to say, although I am the last speaker, it's been a real pleasure to hear ideas about a summit for democracy from my friends and colleagues on the panel. And I especially want to thank Ted Picone, who has worked on democratic solidarity and civil society protections for so many years, for setting the stage for our discussion today. The health and resilience of our democracies depends on our ability to address challenges and also to take advantages of opportunities. And I think we have heard great ideas today for both paths at a Summit for Democracy. Candidate Joe Biden first mentioned the concept of a Summit for Democracy a little over 1 year ago. And he stated the idea of a summit as being meant to renew the spirit and shared purpose of the nations of the free world. Today, I think in our discussion, we've looked at how that spirit could actually be renewed and what would be the practical outcomes of finding again a shared purpose for democracies. Let me just mention a few ideas that I've had, some of which have been raised by my colleagues on the panel already. First of all, I think the goal of democratic solidarity being strengthened should be an important outcome of the Summit for Democracy. I know that there are some that have questioned this goal, saying that this will just create divisions between the free world and the rest of the world. But I disagree with this criticism. There are issues like the pandemic or climate change, which don't limit themselves to political boundaries. For things like that, we always are going to need universal membership bodies like the United Nations. But I do think democracies can act in solidarity on these issues as values-based coalitions within these multilateral bodies. As one example, I think membership in the UN Human Rights Council. Obviously, that should include countries with strong democracy and fundamental human rights records. Within the Council, I think democracies united across regional boundaries can isolate any of these authoritarian regimes that find their way onto the Council and use their place on the Council to undermine the credibility and effectiveness of the body from within. Authoritarian governments have been increasingly successful in the expansion of autocracy and in contrasting their model, a different model of governance, against democracy. And it's been to the detriment of their people and to people all around the world. And so if we are to ensure democracy is strengthened, democracies together need to counter this narrative. And I think we need to confidently present the democratic governance model as not perfect, as one that is needing constant correction and watchdogging, but still the one system that most effectively preserves human rights and meets citizens' needs. I'd also like to touch on one other thing, and that is the challenges facing society clearly require today a collective and unified effort from all democracy stakeholders. And this was highlighted in the UN 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, which emphasized the need for inclusive partnerships and for governments with civil society, with the private sector, to work together to accomplish these important goals. And even though democracy is not mentioned specifically in the agenda, working together collectively in solidarity, I think democracies can lead on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and they can ensure meaningful progress in human rights and democracy. Another important outcome, in addition to democratic solidarity, for a Summit for Democracy could be the acknowledgement that all democracies need strengthening. Events of the past decade, events of the past few months, show us the fragility of democracy. I know that for myself, I've been active in the field of democracy support for nearly 3 decades. And I know that originally we always used to view democracies on the one hand as established and consolidated, and on the other hand as beginning transition or as electoral democracies. Lessons from 1 or 2, maybe 3 of the same countries were the frameworks that were always used to discuss democracy with the newer democracies. And I would say that at this Summit for Democracy, let's retire this outdated approach. And let's publicly acknowledge that democracies need to and can learn from one another. And that what we see as the older established political systems aren't necessarily superior to newer ones. And that lessons on the vital role of civil society can come to us from across the world. So even as the summit acknowledges the fragility of democracy, as we've seen in the United States, it should also celebrate the resiliency of democracy, as we also saw in the United States recently. And we see that around the world. Democracy everywhere is pushing back, not so much through its governmental leaders, but through citizens who are taking to the streets around the world. The late civil rights leader and US Congressman John Lewis said, democracy is not a state, it is an act. And each generation must do its part. And I think we see this happening, and it's changing the dynamics all around the world. People power is winning in some places, and it's paying a very high price in many others, but nowhere is it giving up. The summit is going to energize these movements, and I think, as Joe mentioned, as others have mentioned, we need to be ready for that. We need democratic nations and their policymakers to be ready to help the men and women that will take inspiration from a summit for democracy. As others on the panel have said so much better than I could, the best means of addressing these challenges to democracy requires dialogue, and inclusive policies. We need to listen to the voices of all the groups in society, including minorities and vulnerable groups. It's clear government, we all agree, needs to be engaged in a dialogue with civil society. We were fortunate at the 33rd Governing Council meeting of the Community of Democracies this week to hear from our civil society pillar, who reminded us of this very important aspect of democracy. A state cannot address democracy challenges alone. They must have civil society there because it plays a vital role in promoting fundamental rights and freedoms and fighting corruption and promoting transparency and raising awareness of issues and challenges, bringing their grassroots knowledge and expertise to help shape policies. And our civil society speakers on the panel today have really highlighted this very clearly in their remarks. In concluding, let me just also repeat something that has been said by more than one of the panelists. And there is a very specific objective I think we should work towards in a summit for democracy. And that's in pushing back against authoritarianism and moving to strengthen the narrative around democracy. We are going to have to consider how we mitigate technological threats to democracy and human rights. In the 1990s, we saw the development of digital technology as a natural aid to the work of democracy promotion and support. We wrongly saw the authoritarians as dinosaurs who wouldn't understand how to use and wouldn't benefit from new technology. And I don't have to tell you, we were wrong. For a while, the new technology helped isolated reformers in places like Iran or Syria to stay in touch with the world. And as Maria mentioned, digital technology is of great assistance to reformers in Tanzania still today. But much too quickly, what we saw in this new technology as belonging to the world of freedom and democracy has instead been abused to suppress human rights and fundamental freedoms. And this is an area in which the new Community of Democracies Working Group on Democracy and Technology is trying to focus on seeking whole of society approaches to address disinformation and to develop safeguards and multi-stakeholder governance models to prevent the further abuse of new technologies. A summit for democracy, a gathering of free nations, I think is going to have the impetus to reclaim digital technology for the good of people as one of its primary objectives and goals. Let me just go ahead and stop there because I know we have other ideas to hear, both from the participants who have been listening, as well as from our discussants. So thank you, Patricia.
Thank you, Secretary General, and thank you for highlighting so well those comments and the shared purpose of democracies and the importance of unifying and collective commitment that we need to have, not only at the summit, but certainly moving forward. The panel has certainly offered us very important and interesting thoughts on what potential a summit for democracy can look like. But let me take the time right now to turn to the audience for some questions. We have a lot of questions, and I apologize beforehand if I don't get to your question because we're running out of time. But in the interest of time, let me ask the first question, perhaps to all of our speakers. What kind of commitments do you have in mind that participants could agree to at a potential summit for democracy? And again, it's a question for any of our speakers. Maybe Ted, if you want to take that.
Well, thanks. We heard so many good ideas in the course of the last hour, and I would just throw out a couple of specific ones. You know, we talked about the Global Magnitsky Act and the importance of having some accountability or some sort of solidarity collective approach when there's flagrant abuses of democratic rights. And Kevin underscored how that's changed, what those threats look like, and the importance of having good assessments of when that tipping point is reached that demand action, but the the current environment of human rights and corrupt action, there are plenty of targets, I think, and I think it would really be a concrete way for the Summit for Democracy to build up the political will and then the follow-up action to have some kind of global Magnitsky Act. That would be one example. I like Joe's example on and Sunita's on the work that's been done through the UK anti-corruption front, the beneficial ownership issues, the open contracting partnership. There's some very concrete things, but not all governments have signed up to it, and let alone implement it. So let's use the summit to take the things that have already emerged from other good summits, like those two examples, and push them forward, get more governments to support that.
Thank you, Ted.
Can I come in?
Yes, of course, Maria. Oh, Sunita.
Yeah,
Yes.
no problem at all.
I
Thank
can
you.
come later.
Thanks very much. And it's a great question, because I think we need to really focus now on the concrete opportunities for commitments. So picking up on the ambition of joining together the work around climate and the work on democracy, I think there are opportunities for commitments on how we reduce corruption-related obstacles to decarbonization and to green growth in the fossil fuel producer countries. So what that could look like, for example, is transparency around the transition. So fossil fuel producing countries could commit to disclose and analyze data on capture and corruption risks, on subsidization, on economic exposure and resiliency to energy transition impacts or carbon intensity. We could also see opportunities to raise the bar on better governance around the critical mineral supply chain. That could be stronger supply chain standards or investing in governance and anti-corruption in mineral producing countries. And then, of course, as Ted said, I think beneficial ownership, transparency, and screening is a great opportunity. There is some global momentum here, but we could reach a real tipping point on that front. So just a couple of ideas. Thanks.
Thank you, Sunita. And Maria, I believe you wanted to speak.
Yeah, thank you. Just to add to the list, if this is a wish list. So I think first, two things I would say. First, so the governance of these commitments, because otherwise it's like up in the air. So I would like this to become sort of a strong coalition of governments that really raise the bar and lead by ambition or lead by example. And so by that, I mean two things. The first, like going down and grounded into specifics. The first is the international sort of view, and the second one is more the domestic. Because today, for example, in the priorities that we have with the government of Korea, it's very difficult for the co-creation of commitments between civil society and governments to co-create or to come up with commitments that are at the core of the problem with the relationship between both the government and civil society organizations. For example, a country that is, I don't know, killing journalists, they won't do a commitment related to protecting journalists. So we need the international commitments of the democracies that really take this seriously and create a coalition, a community, or a collective action to protect, in this case, activists or whatever is the need from a specific country. So the international view of the coalition or a possible coalition that could be created this year. And then if we can add one other thing to this list is the idea of, I think someone mentioned it earlier and I did too, about the money in politics. Not only the regulations that are needed for that, but the implementation or the correct implementation of those regulations that need to be passed or need to be in place in any of the countries. And for that, we need the international force, muscle, or effort from other countries rather than, or to push the governments that are not doing that. So domestic and international.
Thank you, Maria. And if no one else has a comment on that, I want to follow up with another question, perhaps the last one. And once again, we're running out of time.
Kevin.
Kevin. Yes, of course.
Real quick.
Please.
Well, I mean, there are all sorts of possible commitments, and some of the most important ones are about strengthening financially and otherwise, in terms also of political support, multilateral mechanisms that are already in place. I mean, I mentioned in my remarks that some of the most effective ways to spread, to disseminate good practices of democratic governance, good practices that would help democracies to deliver better, are done through multilateral organizations, you know, places like the OECD, even the OAS, where I spent, a few years. I mean, this is the kind of thing that can be scaled up and can be strengthened. And also the multilateral mechanisms that exist to not to protect democracy. And here I'm thinking again, I mean, coming from the Americas, I'm thinking of things like the OAS special rapporteur on freedom of expression and freedom of the press, the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, that they are always, you know, teetering on the brink of insolvence and subject to all sorts of political attacks. Well, those mechanisms have never been more important, more relevant than they are now. So a lot of what we need to do can be do through the mechanisms that are already in place, and commitments to bolster them up are of course welcome.
Thank you, Kevin. Would anybody else like to speak at this moment?
I wanted to thank you, Patricia, and thank you, Secretary General Garrett, for putting this together. It's been extremely illuminating. And I wanted to have a chance to do a few minutes of response from the United States so that folks have an understanding of where we are. I think folks know that we're very nascent in our approach. We very much want to include civil society in our discussions. We want to include private sector, of course. There are a number of ideas that you threw out that we agree with 100%. Firstly, from idea, yes, a summit for democracies. That is very much where we're at. And one that is led with humility. The president likes to say we should lead by the power of our example. And the power of that example is also having a price of admission for ourselves, which means domestic and internal commitments that strengthen, our own democracy with, some humility about what the last few years have been. I wanted to speak to Maria's point on digital. Yes, it's extremely important that we deal in this summit with both the positive side and the negative side of what technology has brought to us. We very much agree with the notion that we should be bridging to other events, the G7, the G20, things that happen in the UN, the Community of Democracies, the OGP. This is not seen as sort of, the one thing, but hopefully it will be an incubator for all of the organizations. And in particular, I think organizations that have the sort of co-creation impulse that OGP has, which I think is a great model for us to all think about as we come to the summit. There was a lot to talk about, and I don't have the time to really mention everything, but I want to thank all of the panelists for your presentations. They're extremely useful, and you will see much more from us in the coming weeks and months. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynn, for those words and providing this important feedback to the speakers and to our audience today as well. I think we have ran out of time at this moment, but I would like to once again thank our distinguished speakers today and participants to the event towards a Summit for Democracy. We certainly heard substantial ideas regarding the organization for this global gathering for democracy, and also discussed possible outcomes and key activities that can take place in such a gathering. I thank once again our esteemed speakers and thank those who joined us from around the world. We look forward to hosting you for another discussions on issues of democracy very soon. Until then, on behalf of the Permanent Secretariat of the Community of Democracies, I hope you stay safe. Thank you.